Hello AP Biology students, let's go over the fifth section of Unit 2. And in this section, we're going to go over something called the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is an internal framework of proteins that help support the cell from the inside. And oddly, I'm going to throw in the cell wall in this section just because it doesn't really fit in the other sections and it kind of helps support the cell, but from the outside. The cell wall is specifically made of carbohydrates and proteins and helps maintain the shape of the cell. It also aids in protection for the cell, but we can see what the cell wall kind of looks like here. You can see the cell membrane down here, and usually what happens is the cell wall is made of different proteins and carbohydrates. Here's an interesting look of what a cell wall looks like I found on the line, but you can see this is just a protection layer for the cell outside the cell that helps keep the shape of the cell. Now, the cytoskeleton is going to be a network of protein fibers that are going to be found within the cell. We have three different types of these protein fibers, and we're going to separate them based on size. One of the other major functions of the cytoskeleton is to help move things around the internal parts of the cell, which basically means that we're just moving things in the cell. And before I move on, the cytoskeleton is dynamic. It rearranges itself as needed. So these proteins, these fibers, these connective parts of the cell are going to be broken down and built back up whenever the cell needs to transport things to new areas of the cell. Our first type of cytoskeleton is something called a microfilament, or also called actin filaments. These actin filaments are going to be made of an actin monomer that are bonded together, and this actin filament is going to help the cell with its structural support and with movement. You can see these actin filaments here throughout the whole cell, and again, this just helps with the support structure of the cell. Our next type of cytoskeleton is something called an intermediate filament. This is, again, a little bit larger than the actin filaments, but their function is to support the nuclear envelope and the plasma membrane. These intermediate filaments are going to be the most static, which means they're not going to be broken down and built back up very often, but they are the most static just in general. An example of the intermediate filaments is going to be keratin. And as you can see, these are the keratin filaments that we find within the cell. The last type of cytoskeletal structure we're going to talk about is something called a microtubule, and these are the largest. These are small hollow cylinders that are made of a protein called tubulin, and they kind of act as a highway system for the cell. Now, they do have other functions, but these are basically a highway system that different motor proteins are going to use to move different organelles and molecules around the cell. Here is a network of microtubules you can see within the cell, and again, these are just like the major highways of a cell.